The actor Kevin Bacon's face is everywhere. You've seen him in films and on TV and in commercials and on billboards, and I've seen him in person several times at Fresh Town, and he and his lovely wife, Kira Sedgwick, really like Sarah Vaughan, so I've seen them there. His face is so familiar, though, that he is the subject of a game known as 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. It's based on the theory of 6 degrees of separation, that anyone on Earth can be connected to any other person through a chain of acquaintances that has no more than 5 intermediaries. Theoretically, you know someone who knows someone else, who knows this other person, etc., until you should have established a connection with just about anyone anywhere in the world. In the case of the Kevin Bacon game, one player names an actor, and the other one attempts to make a connection in 6 moves to other actors who have acted with Kevin Bacon. You get the idea. Though he is almost instantly recognizable, there was a time when Kevin Bacon worked with a makeup artist who created a prosthetic that made very subtle changes to his face. And suddenly he was able to walk around Los Angeles or Armenia and not be recognized. And he didn't like it. It was almost disturbing, he said. People kind of looked right through me, and they weren't nice to me. He reflected that because of his fame, he was used to being treated well. And suddenly he was no longer getting that boost to his ego, to his sense of self. Most of us aren't famous the way Kevin is, but we may have had a similar experience. Maybe we've been a waiter in a restaurant, or have worked in retail, or as a teacher, and even in the role of a lawyer or a financial advisor. We know a lot of people, and a lot of people know us. We establish friendly relationships with the people we serve. We're glad to see them, and they're glad to see us. But take off the uniform, or leave our place of work, or show up with our young child wearing jeans, and suddenly we're unrecognizable. Instead of a smile and a wave, we may be treated like a stranger. What happened to that connection we used to have? Luke tells us of an incident following the crucifixion on Easter morning. A disciple named Cleopas and an unnamed disciple were walking to Emmaus, a town little more than 7 miles from Jerusalem, and suddenly Jesus, the risen Christ, joins them. We assume that there is only 1 degree of separation, but they don't recognize him. What blinded them to the presence of Jesus beside them? Was there a subtle change to his face in the way that he walked? Was he not in uniform? There are plenty of examples in Scripture of humankind coming into the presence of the divine or of angels without knowing it. Abraham encounters the divine presence at the Oaks of Mamre and doesn't know who these 3 men are. Moses hears a voice speaking out of the burning bush, but doesn't know who it is at first. And Samson's parents see God without first knowing it. This story on the road to Emmaus ends well because the 2 disciples show hospitality to this person they assume to be a stranger. According to the letter to the Hebrews, we should show hospitality to strangers, for by doing this, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Even so, there is a sense in this passage that the disciples should have known who walked with them. Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the Scriptures to us? They ask each other later. So what did they miss? Rather than focus right away on what they did wrong, let's look at what they got right. The first thing they do correctly is widen their circle to include this outsider. They don't walk a little faster or ignore him, Though they don't recognize Jesus, they enter into a conversation with him about recent events. They include him about their feelings. And after expressing astonishment that this stranger apparently knows nothing about the crucifixion of Jesus, they talk about their disappointment because they'd had such hope in Jesus. And how now, 3 days later, the women, maybe including Cleopas' wife, had found the tomb empty and had received a vision of angels telling them Jesus is alive. But, they add, that some of the male disciples went to the empty tomb and they saw nothing. These disciples are talking to the risen Christ about the death of Jesus and that the news that Jesus is risen without recognizing that they are talking to Jesus. So how could they miss the obvious? In the short story Silver Blaze, Sherlock Holmes solves a crime that took place in a horse paddock by drawing the attention of a detective from Scotland Yard to a curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. The detective protests the dog did nothing in the nighttime, and Holmes replies, that was the curious incident. Holmes goes on to explain that had a stranger entered, the dog would have barked. Therefore, the suspect had to be someone known to the dog, which drastically cuts down on the number of suspects. As a sidebar, the mystery novel of that title, which is now a Broadway play actually, has as its central character Christopher John Francis Boone, a 15-year-old boy who describes himself as a mathematician with some behavioral difficulties, which is understood to mean that he is on the Asperger's autism spectrum. But Mark Haddon, the novel's author, said that Curious Incident is not a book about Asperger's. If anything, it's a novel about difference, about being an outsider, about seeing the world in a surprising and revealing way. So in the Emmaus Road case, what was the curious thing that they overlooked? Do you know what it is? It is the witness of the women they mentioned earlier. In that era, women were not allowed to testify in the Roman court because they were considered by men to be untrustworthy witnesses. Thank goodness God does not agree with that, because in all four Gospels, the first people to carry the news of the empty tomb are all women. So were the disciples blinded by their preconceptions? The ancient world's second-class gender was the first source of the resurrection's proclamation. If these disciples rejected the testimony of the women, they were not prepared to see Jesus, even though the fact of his resurrection was staring them right in the face. Despite their blindness in this regard, Jesus explained to the disciples other clues they ought to have gotten, those passages in the law and the prophets that pointed to a Christ who is a suffering servant. As I mentioned, the story ends well because these two disciples do the right thing through their hospitality. In Jesus' time, guests were expected to refuse an offer of hospitality until they were strongly urged to stay. This the disciples do. They offer him sustenance. And Jesus, who to this day does not force himself on us, made a further step and took over the role of host, giving thanks and breaking the bread. And in doing this, suddenly, as if he had put back on his servant uniform, the disciples finally recognized Jesus. This is perhaps the most profound thing that this scripture tells us. We recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread. This is just as true now as then. When we break bread with each other here in church, when we break bread together with each other in restaurants or at home, when we insist on sharing hospitality with those whom God sends our way, when we are courageous and open the circle, we recognize Jesus in our midst. Think of the people who have become significant in your life. Perhaps we knew the moment we met someone that our life was changed. But so often, it is only in hindsight that we see how important that person has become to us. Julian Strauss is a local. He would call himself a farmer, but he trained at Cornell as a veterinarian, and he has a degree from Yale School of Public Health. He's quite a Renaissance man, and actually several of you know him and know Tilly, his wonderful artist daughter, who raised her sons, Kent and Max, here at St. Peter's. And Tilly, by the way, is responsible for creating the elaborate papier-mâché crowns that we use in the pageant. In any case, Julian is a Millbrook alum as well, and we invited him to speak this past week at our cum laude induction dinner for our seniors. And knowing full well that one of Millbrook's core values is stewardship of the natural world, he gave us some interesting ways to think about sustainability. Yes, sustainability is a buzzword, and a worthy one, carried out in our actions by recycling and by consuming less. He's all for that. But he went on to note a few experiences he had in which his inner life was sustained by relationships, and that this kind of sustainability might be even more important than unplugging technology and reducing our carbon footprint. He told us a story of when he was working in Haiti in a medical clinic. He had made several mission trips with the Paul Farmer group, Doctors Without Borders, and this was his third trip to Port-au-Prince, working in a besieged part of the city where there were long lines of people waiting for treatment. And he had just arrived from the US and was dropped off a block from the clinic to walk in, and he walked along past all of these people lining the streets in different stages of illness and injury. And he passed one gentleman, though, who nodded to him, and as he continued on, the gentleman called out to him. Dr. Strauss heard him above the noise of the street, feeling a kind of familiarity with that voice, and even though he needed to get to the clinic to start treating patients, he turned around and went back to the man. The gentleman called him by name in Creole, remembering Dr. Strauss from his last trip to Port-au-Prince when he had treated the gentleman's son for malaria. The gentleman stood erect with his arms across his stomach and simply said, "How are you? It is so good to see you." Noticing that this man was standing in line to be treated himself, Dr. Strauss said, "I really must ask you, how are you?" And the man said, "Oh, I'm well." And Dr. Strauss pressed him a little further, and then the man almost shamefully pulled his arms away from his abdomen to reveal a wound so deep that you could see his innards. Dr. Strauss made a quick change of plans, brought the gentleman straight to the clinic ahead of others in less medical trouble, and gave him the attention he needed. And to this day, what sustains Dr. Strauss is not that he treated the gentleman, but that the gentleman, a supposed stranger, reached out to him, touched his arm, and said, "How are you?" He was sustained and transformed by the voice, by the touch, by the hospitality of this wounded, suffering stranger. Looking back on our own lives, we often only recognize Jesus and his presence in hindsight. We recognize Jesus in hospitality, in the breaking of the bread. We finally know each other for who we are in this hospitality and in the most mundane places, like the streets of Port-au-Prince. There's a wonderful irony to this gospel story. The disciples think they know everything about Jesus, but Jesus knows everything about them. This reminds us that we're not the experts we think we are. We must listen to each other. Listen to the stranger in our midst. Just as the gentleman did with Dr. Strauss, so does Jesus play host, even as a guest. Do we allow guests to take their place at the head of the line, at the head of the Lord's table? After they recognize Jesus and he is then taken from them, the disciples discover that their plans suddenly don't seem so important. And immediately they turn around and go straight back to Jerusalem, from which they came. They changed their plans. They turned around. This is the sign that told them and that tells us that the resurrection is alive among us. Getting back to Kevin Bacon, that stranger in our midst could be a celebrity, but far more important, that stranger sent into our midst by God may be Jesus with us, Emmanuel. Let's ask ourselves, why don't we recognize Jesus all around us, in the ordinary people we serve and who serve us? Perhaps our eyes can be opened, as were those of the two disciples, as were those of Julian Strauss, as potentially are ours, to see Jesus clearly in a simple touch and a kind voice saying, "How are you?"